Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real Talk with Witlee Ethan on the Live Each Day with Purpose podcast. I'm very excited. I have a special guest. Her name is Joy Forrest. She is the founder and executive director of Call to Peace Ministries. She is the author of Call to Peace, a survivor's guide to finding peace and healing after domestic abuse, and the Call to Peace Companion Workbook. Joy holds an MA in biblical counseling from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary and has been active in counseling ministry since 2005. She has been an advocate for victims of abuse since 1997 and held the position of community educator with a local domestic violence agency from 2000 to 2001. Joy is a contributing expert for Divorce Care's Recovery Support Group curriculum and the Institute for Biblical Counseling and Discipleship Counseling Care for Domestic Abuse videos. In her spare time, Joy loves traveling, spending time with her family, especially her 10 grandchildren. Joy, welcome.
Thank you, Witlee. I appreciate it.
I'm so excited about this episode because I know that this is going to be spreading a lot of awareness. And it's probably going to be very eye-opening for a lot of people with a lot of different terms out there that are kind of floating around on social media. I think that this will actually explain a lot and give people a lot of good information from kind of the information that they're just taking from online. So how do you tell if someone is an abuser or if someone is safe?
There are a lot of warning signs, although I will say that there are a lot of women that have come through our ministry who had none of the red flags. They know how to fake it for a while. So one thing you want to do is make sure you are with somebody a long, long time. Actually, I had a friend say to me recently that she heard 2 years to be with somebody for a couple of years because abusers tend to kind of zone in on us, kind of sweep us off our feet. And the courtship tends to be very short in many cases because they can only fake it for so long, but not always. There's some that can fake it for a long time. And so there are many red flags. You know, I found some of the most common ones are extreme jealousy right up front. You'll see them being jealous or maybe just a little critical of you and criticizing what you do or wanting to make decisions for you or having strong opinions about the way you dress. These are early warning signs. But there are just so many over time. There's actually a checklist on our website called topeace.org. You can go over and check that out. But you know, you'll also find that you'll begin to find yourself very confused. So they like to twist words. No, I didn't say that. That's not the way it happened. So they have a way of reinterpreting history a lot of times that can be a huge red flag. But the red flags vary from time to time for different people, different abusers. And so we can't always say 100%. This person's not going to show any of those warning signs because I've known women who he waited till after the wedding to change.
Wow. Yeah. I will say that one red flag is if they're wanting to move fast very quickly.
Yes, absolutely.
And I experienced that with my ex. But you know, I think a lot of times women will get so caught up in, wow, he must really be interested in me. He just must really like me, that it's easy to kind of overlook that as being a red flag and thinking, well, if I'm starting to feel things and he's feeling things, we must be on the same page. Like this must be fate, you know, kind of thing. And I think it's very easy to, unfortunately, overlook red flags that are very evident that other people might be able to see that we might have a hard time seeing because of our feelings, but our feelings aren't facts. So I think, you know, we need to keep that in mind. How do you protect yourself from someone who is abusive? I mean, what are the ways to get away? What are the ways to protect yourself? I mean, it's such a tricky situation because it can become dangerous very fast.
Yeah, it is tricky. And I would say that the further along you are in a relationship, the harder it is to get disentangled. One thing is that, so we're talking, as far as I'm concerned, for my Christian faith, what you will see happening is that all of a sudden somebody besides God has control of your life, that you are trying very hard to please this person instead of trying to please God. And it's out of fear a lot of times. So what we have to learn to do early on, and it's a little safer, usually safer early on, but not always. Once you start setting boundaries or saying no to someone like that, and it might be a good way to test the relationship early on, they can show their true colors a lot of times when you start doing that. To get away and get out of it, it really depends on where you are in that process. So early on, you might start saying no, and they may go, oh, I'm just not going to deal with this woman. I don't know. But I mean, if they've already set their sights on you, just being calm and kindly saying no, trying not to react to somebody like that, because it gives them more power when we react. And so, but once it gets to the point of really dangerous, and you can reach out to us at Called to Peace Ministries. We have advocates who can help you assess how dangerous your situation is. So we have something called a lethality assessment. You can go and find one online as well. But if you have several of the things that are on that lethality index, maybe even just one, it could be that is something that you don't want to ignore, because I've seen situations that there was no physical harm, like no punching, no slapping, nothing physical, according to the ladies that were going through it. Maybe in one case, 11 years, in another case, 25 years, in another case, 30 years, no physical violence. And then when they finally decided they'd had enough and crossed them, there was attempted murder for all three of these ladies that I know. So you want to be extremely careful. If you find yourself living in fear, then you want to get help from an expert. So a domestic violence shelter, an expert, an advocate at a domestic violence shelter called to Peace Ministries has advocates, although we're a little backlogged right now. But just getting yourself educated and finding out, is this truly abuse? And then making sure you partner with somebody who is an expert in it so that they can help you get out.
Yeah, you were just talking about, physical and, attacks and stuff. Is that just what abuse is, or is there more to abuse? And can you kind of elaborate? Is it just if someone hits you? Is it just if someone beats you? Is it?
No, absolutely not. In fact, so for many years, I was with my ex-husband for years and years, and I never called it abuse. I knew he grew up with abuse. He had seen his dad beat his mom. He hated it, and he did not want to turn out that way. And so when he basically, when we first got married, there was just this control. There was a lot of criticism. I didn't know, I was stupid and naive, and all the things that he said to me. He would keep me up late at night and not let me sleep, just basically complaining about his life and sort of blaming me for him at the same time. And there were so many things that were not physically violent until I think it was 11 years into our relationship. And I told him, after not being able to sleep at night, after him blocking the doorway and not letting me out, that is actually all domestic abuse. And just even emotional abuse is domestic abuse. So basically name calling, making you feel crazy. People call it gaslighting now, but basically changing the facts, twisting the truth, so that you're confused. And so on the power and control wheel, which is a little tool that I found that actually helped me finally identify what I'd been through for 23 years as abuse. And so, but the first time that I finally called him on it, that's when it became physically violent. And that was 11 years in. I ended up staying 23. And, the majority of those years, there was no physical violence. So no hitting. Actually, he never punched me. What did he? Yes, he kicked me. There actually was a knife incident earlier in the marriage. And I started setting strong boundaries, calling the police anytime he just looked at me like he was going to do something. And so the physical violence stopped for several years of the marriage until after I had put him through medical school. When he got out and I started staying home, I wasn't the main breadwinner anymore. All of a sudden, the violence started to creep back in because he knew I couldn't really survive without him. And it's interesting that these guys do know that. They will try to set you up so that you can't survive without them. They like for you to be financially dependent on them. So that's all part of it. So there's financial abuse. There's actually, if you find a power and control wheel, there's 8 different tactics or types of tactics on there: financial abuse, emotional abuse, intimidation, threats, and using the children, using male privilege. And so if you look at those, and there's a few more that I'm forgetting right now, if you look at all of those, none of them are physical abuse. And that's considered, and we still, back in the day, we called it domestic violence. For me, it was very confusing because actually when I got out, it was called battering. They still called it battering. And so there's no way he was never battering me. So, understanding, getting yourself educated, but looking at that and seeing that 90% of those tactics were not physical abuse. The physical abuse only happens when the other ones don't, those other tactics don't work usually.
You talked about gaslighting and kind of how it's become this term that's now being used. There's also another pop psychology term that's being used, which is narcissist. And there's a lot of things floating out there. Narcissist, it's tied to personality disorder, or it's a mental health issue. So it's something they can't control, or it is something that they can control and they're choosing to be this way. Which one is it? I mean, it's really confusing. And I think it's also confusing to a lot of people because it can minimize how severe it is and cause, I think, even professionals who might be wanting to help people or people within the justice system to minimize and not address it as they should, because it's just, oh, he's just being this way.
Yeah.
So what is it? Is it something that they can control?
Generally speaking. So this is something, and this is why we don't really like using the term narcissist. I mean, I have used it because it is a narcissistic thing. Narcissism meaning that it's somebody is very self-centered and it's all about them. And so, yes, I will say narcissistic types of behavior, but to say that every person who uses these kinds of tactics is a narcissist or has a narcissistic personality disorder is actually, I think, a dangerous fallacy, because I think what we like is that we don't want to call it abuse. I certainly didn't after 23 years. Thankfully, the narcissistic kick wasn't popular back then, but we don't want to call it abuse, and we don't want to think that our partners are choosing to hurt us. And so that's the bottom line, is that most of the time, and this is what we say in domestic abuse circles. So now we're calling it coercive control instead of domestic abuse most of the time. So when we talk about coercive control, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Basically, what we say to people is, this is a choice. It is not caused by mental health issues. It is not caused. So for example, I had a woman that came to me and she goes, my husband's bipolar. This is why he was being abusive and so cruel to her and her children, so much so that they all had post-traumatic stress. And I said, okay, but I know other people who have bipolar disorder and they're not abusing their partners.
Right.
And other people will say, well, my husband's an alcoholic and that's why he abuses me. And I'm like, I know other people who are alcoholics who don't abuse their partners. And so what we finally have to realize is that they're making a choice. It's one of the hardest parts of the healing process. For me, it was like, he can't help himself. It's just the way that he was raised. He cannot, and he's having these little nervous breakdowns. He can't help himself. So I was telling this to a guy at a program that we found years ago. And he says, so you really think that he can't control himself, that this is just some behavior that takes over him? And I said, yeah. He said, really? So when he's breaking things around the house, whose stuff does he break? Does he break his stuff or does he just break your stuff? And I'm like, just my stuff. And then he says, and does he treat people at work like this? And I said, no, not really. So not generally, at least not to the degree, like sometimes that side of him would slip out, but he kept it under control there. So that just shows you that it's a choice that they're making, generally speaking. Unless they're like a sociopath or a psychopath, then maybe those folks can't. But somebody, I believe, it's like you were saying that you talked to a clinician who said not all people with narcissistic personality disorder are even abusive. So there's still this element of choice that we have to recognize. And I believe that's part of accepting the acceptance we have to come to, that realizing they're making a choice, which is very hard because it means that they never loved us. And we want to believe that they truly love, but they really don't have that capacity, or they're not choosing to use it. I mean, they've got issues for sure. And a lot of them are very insecure, but that is not what's causing them to abuse. They're making a choice to use power and control over you.
Yeah, I mean, with my ex, I knew something wasn't right. And it definitely seemed different from any type of other past relationship I'd gone through. And I mean, I kept seeing things online posting about, this is narcissism or gaslighting or just different things. And I'm like, that kind of sounds like what I'm going through. And it wasn't until I reached out to Julie Owens, who is actually a member of your board. You know her. She's an expert. She was recently on Nancy Grace talking about things that had gone on with the trial. And I talked to her and I said, so Julie, what is this? Like, here's what's happened. Is it just that he's a narcissist? And she said, no, that is domestic abuse. And oh my gosh, Joy, my heart sank, because I think to say he's just a narcissist was so much easier to accept and even kind of get me to feel bad for him. Like, wow, he must have a lot going on. He must have issues. He must have traumas. Poor him. But to then hear what she said, it was like, wow, this was a lot worse than I thought it was. And then as I was able to really take a step back after I got out, after I've had no contact in place, made clear to him he's not to be contacting me, I was able to really look at things, and it was like things were really, really bad. I dodged a bullet. Wow, this was bad. And I think by using the word narcissist or narcissism, it kind of does degrade what you're going through. And I don't think that is helpful to anybody, because it's just kind of like this, easy to accept kind of word, as if it's just, there's no red flags. There's, no red lights or whatever. It's not going to be alerting you to any danger. And I think then it helps them to get away with their behavior.
Right. It minimizes it to a personality issue, or it minimizes it to a mental health issue, and it almost gives them an excuse for it. And there is no excuse for what's happening. So yeah, it can be dangerous, because if it's just this, oh, they're just a narcissist, then we don't recognize the danger that we might recognize when we actually call it for what it is. So it's domestic abuse, coercive control.
Yeah. And there's like a lot of, I probably get a few a day that come through my feed on social media of things about narcissists, not things about abusers, things about narcissists, different traits and everything. And so I went online and I was like, okay, what are traits of an abuser? Guys, they are the exact same traits that they're saying this is a narcissist. And so I was like, I wonder if people heard these traits under it being an abuser, if it might hit differently than if it was like, oh, it's just a narcissist. Abuser, he's charming, jealous, manipulative, controlling, a victim, blames everybody for anything going on in his life. He can be narcissistic, inconsistent, critical, disconnected, hypersensitive, vicious and cruel, and sincerely repentant. Can have a split personality where he's super sweet and thoughtful one moment, and then it's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and angry and explosive the next. Push and pull, drives you away, but then tries to find a way to bring you back. Demands servitude and worship. That you care for them, that you're meeting their emotional, physiological, physical, and needs. They blame you. They shift the blame, manipulation and control via criticism. And I think people need to really realize that a narcissist is a term that we shouldn't maybe be giving so much power to, because it's downplaying what it really is. And if you're experiencing that, you're the victim of abuse.
Yeah.
And this isn't something to just, this isn't something he can't control. This is a mental health issue, which, yeah, he could have a narcissistic personality disorder, but just like with any mental health disorder, it doesn't justify the mistreatment or abuse. And, I think it's safe to say that there are some, it comes down to intention. I think there's a lot of people in this world that have mental health struggles, but are they getting the help? Are they trying to overcome whatever that struggle is and be the best that they can be while on their mental health journey? There's a lot of people who don't do that. And, they're not trying to be the best, and they're not trying to be the safest, not just for them, but for other people. And so I think when it gets to someone having a mental health disorder and they're not safe, rather than sympathy and excusing their actions, we need to take action, and that action should be to create separation for safety, not to give them another chance or ignore it or excuse it. I mean, what are your thoughts, Joy?
Well, one thing that we teach in our advocacy training is that what we want to do is help empower people to make wise decisions. Generally speaking, getting out is the best thing, but there are situations where getting out can actually make things worse, especially like if I have a woman who stays to this day because her husband has been married twice before her, and he's gotten full custody of the children, and she's afraid of that. And with our courts not understanding abuse well, that's a very good possibility. So she stays for the sake of him. I love the work of my friend Leslie Vernick. She talks about either leaving well or staying well, as long as you can stay well and safely. And there really is, I feel like there's some kind of a continuum. And so you can check and to see if it's lethal, you just really do need to get out. So checking, looking at that lethality assessment. There's one called Mosaic, I believe, that you can access online, just the Mosaic lethality assessment. But, generally it is better, because how can you heal from the post-traumatic stress that most of us have when we've gone through these things? How can you move forward? How is it going to not affect your children to be around it all the time? But then you got to keep in mind that with our courts, the courts could give him, at least 50% custody without you there. So yes, it's definitely something to consider. I personally would think that getting out is the best option most of the time, but not always.
So I would think that, just with dating in general, it can be a pretty dangerous thing. You date the wrong person and you will suffer from doing that. And so I think that that's why it's so important to take your time getting to know someone, because someone who does have abusive behaviors, or someone who does maybe have any type of mental illness that they're not getting treated for, and that, not everybody with mental illness chooses to abuse. Let's just make that very clear. It's a choice. So nothing against anyone with mental illness. I think if you're with someone and you're seeing any type of concerning behavior, mental illness or not, this is why getting to know them and taking that time to get to know them, you would be able to see that, rather than kind of being in the thick of it and then being like, how do I leave? How do I get out of it? And I think, especially if you've experienced trauma in the past, you're so much wanting to be in a healthy relationship that it makes you more vulnerable to be meeting people. And here's the thing, someone once said it's like sharks in the water with blood. Sharks are predators, and so are abusers. And so they know who's vulnerable. They know who's been preyed on before. And especially if you're open with that, they're going to use that against you to take control of you. And even to win your trust. They will come off, as it said, charming. They will come off as trustworthy. They will come off as someone that, you think you're safe with. And then they'll turn around and it'll be really confusing. Like you said, you'll be so confused. And it kind of creates chaos because you're like, wait a second. They were just this perfect, seemingly good guy. Yeah, there might have been some red flags here or there, or oh, I don't know about this, but they seem pretty great. And now this just happened. Is it me? Did I do this? Like, is this just a one-time thing? Are they having a bad day? And so you start questioning things rather than really acknowledging for what it is, which is, that's a huge red flag. And do you want to live with that and that continue? And I think oftentimes we're so caught up in emotions and feelings and everything that we end up finding ourselves in really bad situations. When a lot of times their feelings, I think they were just really good at faking it. They know how to play the role. And I think after being so hurt, and if you've been in past bad relationships, you're kind of hoping and looking for that hero, that guy that's going to be different, that guy that you're going to be able to tell everything that's happened to you too, and who's going to basically be your protector. And we end up trusting the wrong person who's not going to protect us, but actually hurt us even worse than we've been hurt before.
Yeah. And I think you made a really good point. They will do that using information about your past. So that's a red flag up front, is them asking you about your life and then really not sharing a whole lot about theirs. It may be a lot more vague when they share about theirs. Oh, they may have been a victim somewhere, because a lot of these guys will claim to be victims as well. But that early on, trying to get all your information, and then they end up they're, oh, I'm going to help you and I would never treat you that way. And then all of a sudden they turn into the same person or worse, or a different type of abuser, but definitely abusive. And so that is an early red flag, that somebody who's coming in to rescue you and asking all these details about your past. So giving that kind of information early on in the relationship actually can hurt you in the long run, because they will definitely use it as a weapon against you.
So when should you share that? I mean, because I think women, they want to be open. And I think there's this kind of push and pull. Like, do you share this much? Do you not share this much? Well, if you're not sharing, is it that you don't trust them, but you're trying to, have a connection, a bond? And so how do you know when to share and how much to share?
Well, I would say that early on in a relationship, it's, I would spend time getting to know them, trying to get information to see if they're trustworthy. You can share little bits and see. I mean, they're not going to necessarily automatically use it against you, but just seeing if you can trust them with other things, and over a period of time. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a good thing to be sharing your entire story, especially if it includes abuse. On the first date, or even in the first month, depending. And I think that the whole thing is, and it's hard for us to do that because we want to be loved. And I know that I felt so desperate for love after coming out of my marriage. Fortunately for me, I was very, very legalistic, and I wasn't divorced, so I didn't date. But I could sense that longing in me, because I felt like I needed to be in a relationship, because that's what abuse sort of sets us up to need, this other person, or I feel like that our existence almost depends on them. And that's what they try to have us feel. So now there are people who get into these relationships who are healthier than that. And I don't think that it's not codependency. It's not that, but it's almost like a trauma response still, that we may still be having from the first relationship, where we feel this desperate need to have somebody come in and rescue us, to be in relationship. And what we really need to do is work on ourselves, work on our relationship with God, and feel like that. Don't get to the point that we don't feel like that we have to be with somebody. If we feel like we have to be with somebody, that's a very unhealthy place to start.
Mm-hmm. you're talking about codependency, and that's also something that's kind of been being posted everywhere. That if you're somehow in a relationship with someone who abuses, the victims kind of been being labeled as codependent. And I mean, talk about that and how that's just not helpful.
It's not helpful because a trauma response looks very much like codependency. Yes, I want to please this person because I don't want to get hurt. And so a lot of times people will go to groups like Al-Anon, things that are supposed to help people who are codependent, and it actually it can make things worse for them. So we don't want to call this codependency. When it comes to domestic abuse, generally speaking, about actually a study that our friend Julie Owens was involved with out at the National Center for PTSD Studies out in Hawaii. They found that 80% of domestic abuse victims who came to them were suffering from post-traumatic stress symptoms. So back then they didn't call it complex post-traumatic stress. Now we have differentiation between the types of PTSD, but so 80%. And I would say that with our ministry, it's at least 90% of the people we serve have post-traumatic stress. So trauma can look like a lot of things. It can look like ADHD in children. It can look like codependency in women, but it's trauma. And so it's basically our bodies reacting so in a way that we are trying to protect ourselves.
There's something that you had said when we were kind of going into the codependency when you talked about that. And I remember when I started dating my ex, that it was every story that he told me of every person he dated, he claimed they abused him. But he also said that they had all been abused, and he knew that, but he kind of felt like he was to be the savior coming in to rescue these damsels in distress kind of thing. And it was just really interesting, the things that he would say and claim they did, that I actually started seeing him doing in our relationship, which made me question, if I were to meet them, what would they say? And he even at one point said, I don't know what they would say if you met them, because he had an ex-wife. I don't know, like, when you meet her, what she would say. And I'm thinking, yeah, what would she say? And he's like, but this is what she did. This is what happened. And it was just really, it was a red flag, especially when, you had talked about not like being supportive and stuff. I remember he would fake support. So he would, like be very caring, seeming like he was going to be supportive. Like, I'm so there. I want to be your protector. Then he would use it against me. And there's this one time when I was talking about something hard. I think for me, it's kind of hard not to share some of my story, because as an advocate, my story is out there. So it's either you read it or I tell you. And so that's kind of something that was going on with this relationship. And Joy, all of a sudden, he just broke down into tears. And I'm like, what is going on? And he's like, I'm sitting in my prayer room and I'm rocking back and forth on the floor. And I'm like, what happened? And he's like, okay, the girl before you, she sexually assaulted me. And I'm like, whoa, what? And he's like, yeah, I can't talk about it. I can't talk about it. And I'm like, well, wait. If this is bothering you this much, you need to talk to your therapist about it. And he literally was crying for a few minutes. And then all of a sudden he was fine. He's like, all right, well, I'll talk to you later today. And I was like, whoa, are you okay? And he's like, yeah, I'm fine. I'll talk to you later today. And I'm like, do you want to talk about this more? And he's like, no, I'm good. And I was like, that's not the typical response after kind of like dropping that bombshell. And guys, when I asked him later, did you talk to your therapist? Because this is something you're going to need to work through for healing. Like this isn't good. This isn't healthy. Like if something happened, you need to work through it. And he's like, no, I didn't need to talk to her about it. And I thought, were you really sexually assaulted?
Right. Yeah. Well, this is what abusive people are very good at, is turning it on and off. emotions and everything else. People think that domestic abuse is an anger problem, but it's really not. They're using anger, and just like he was using tears to manipulate. So, I know that years ago when I would have to call the police, I called the police several times in a couple of year period until I, got to the point where he finally realized that she's not going to put up with this. And I actually started fighting back a little bit for a while. But bottom line is that, sorry, I did it again. It's old senior moment. Anyway,
Tears. The tears.
Oh yeah, turning it on and off. Sorry. When the police would show up, he had been so, like, it seemed like completely out of control. And when the police would come to the house, he would just come out and go, "Oh, officer, I just don't know why she's freaking out so much." And he would minimize it and give them a story that sounded so good and so calm. And of course, I was frantic, and I was the one that seemed out of control at that particular point. So that's why I think that even domestic violence calls are very counterintuitive, like that Gabby Petito situation that happened.
I was just thinking that, Joy. I was just picturing her sitting in the car and him basically saying that she's the crazy one. And the police just kind of
believed him, because he was probably calm, cool, and collected by the time the police showed up. So that's kind of thing that you'll see with these guys, is that they really know how to fake it. And so
I will say that throughout the relationship, there probably really wasn't a time when he wasn't emotional over something. And it was usually whenever I'd come to him, which I came to him a lot, about, this made me uncomfortable. We need to talk about this and work on communication. We had a really good conversation. And then I said, "Oh, I don't agree." And you flipped out. And, it would be very, again, the, high jackal thing, very quickly turning. And I remember when he had smeared me. So I think something that gets asked a lot is, why didn't you leave? Or why didn't you leave sooner? And it's not always easy to leave. And I think also there's so many things to take into consideration, especially when you've formed a bond, when you're in a very close, intimate relationship. It's hard to immediately walk away, because you still have those feelings. No matter how bad they might hurt you, you still have a bond to them and a connection. And so we would kind of go through these things where it would be stop and go. I would ask for space breaks. I need to think through things that he would do or say. And during one of our breakups, he smeared me. He spread rumors about me to people I worked with, to people in the Christian communities. It was very hurtful. When we got back together, he told me he did this. Now, I really wasn't able to respond, because he's sobbing the whole time telling me. And so I'm like, I would really like to tell him exactly how I feel right now. I couldn't, because I was having to deal with his emotions. And then he did write an apology, sent it to the people he smeared me to. And he wrote in it that I didn't handle the breakup very well. I wasn't happy with the breakup. This is why I did this. The response he got from people was, "Oh my gosh, you're such a godly guy. You have such a pure heart. That's amazing that you come forward." I'm thinking, is anybody asking how I'm doing? Is anybody wondering or even holding him accountable? I mean, these are relationship coaches. These are Christians. These are, leaders within, the world that he's going to. These are pastors, and not a single person said, "Why would you do that as a Christian? Why would you?" Like, there's no accountability in the church. There was no accountability by the faith community, which I was appalled by. But also, it caused me to be unable to really be able to get to the heart of it, of how I was feeling, because the focus was always on how he was feeling, which didn't help me. And I don't think that helps any of the abuse victims. Is that, I mean, that's kind of a way of having control where they can turn it on and off, but also where there can be false repentance. Like, I'm sorry. Oh, you're upset. Now I need to smooth things over. And he then tried by sending me 4 dozen roses as an apology. Did it take away the damage done to my reputation? No. Then when he promised to protect me to kingdom come, did that really stick? No, he continued to smear campaign and still has. So I say that to say that you have to really be careful by their apologies, especially apologies laced with scripture. I would constantly get, love conquers all. Love covers over all sins. And I'm like, interesting you're saying this to me when you're talking about the sins and harm you caused. Yeah. That you're telling me, you're quoting to me that if this is really love, it will cover and conquer over all the sins and harm that you caused. But at the same time, if it was really love, he wouldn't have been abusing to begin with.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the thing. I think that's the hardest part of living with this kind of thing, is that we want to believe that they love us. And that's what keeps us trapped for so long, is that we feel, well, he loves me, but he can't help himself. He loves me, but whatever it may be, he's been abused. He's the victim. In fact, for all the years that I was in it, I thought that he was the victim instead of me. So I definitely get that.
Yeah. And I think, also, I think another red flag was, yes, I mean, first of all, we might go through really hard breakups. I mean, past relationships. I think everybody has that. But if you are talking with someone and you're dating them and all you hear is them tell the same story about every one of their relationships and talking about the women the way that they do, every single one of them the same way, don't think they're not going to do that about you, because they will. They're going to say that to somebody. And that was a concern. And, as I look back on it, it was a red flag. And I think it's one that women overlook, because when we hear that, like, a guy's been mistreated and we're like, oh my gosh, she did that. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. And we have compassion and it wins us over, when really we're only hearing one side. And I mean, I hate to say that, but did it really happen? Is it possible that it happened? Yes. But did it really happen? The exact same thing with every woman? I mean, he was even claiming sexual abuse from his mom. And the sexual abuse was when he was younger. His mom had him massage her feet when her feet were tired. And he said, I was sexually abused by my mom. And I'm like, okay. But like, he claimed that with here's the thing, guys. He hasn't told any one of them that he's been going around spreading rumors about them, claiming that they've sexually abused him. And then goes and pretends that he has the best relationship with them. I mean, that's something to take into consideration. I think we can too easily fall for their story and think, poor them. Oh, they just need a good woman. And we can be that woman. We can be the one to show them that this is what love really is. And actually, really, they were the abuser. And I will say, as things kind of went on, I realized, oh, this is bad. He's really the abuser. This is not good. Let's talk about the response by the church, because you guys focus a lot on training, which is amazing. I mean, I would say that the church probably isn't the best at responding to this. I mean, it's not necessarily the first place that women, it'd be great if it was the first place women could go, but it really isn't. So talk about that. You're gonna need to unmute.
Sorry about that.
No,
Sorry.
you're fine.
I have a dog here and I'm afraid she's going to bark anytime.
It's okay.
Anyway, the church hasn't always gotten it right. That's for sure. And in fact, in my early years, it felt like none of them got it. And that it just made going to the church often made things way worse. And I think the barking might come, but we'll see.
Yeah.
Anyway, so, but what I have discovered and what I finally come to believe is that most churches want to get it right. But it's a lack of knowledge. It's like us as victims, we don't even recognize it as abuse. He's such a nice guy. Well, the same thing happens in the church dynamic. So they're easily fooled, but that is changing. So what I've seen, I don't know if it was the Me Too movement. I don't know what caused the change, but have seen so much change in the last, I would say 4 to 5 years. And every year it feels like more and more churches are starting to go, wait a minute, we got a problem here. It's not that they're, it's like not by droves of them are coming in, but we have a church partnership program at Call to Peace Ministries. We'll go in and do trainings with these churches, and we're finding more and more of them wanting to get it right. Some of them even starting domestic abuse programs in their churches, building a team. And what we do is we recommend that they get at least a couple of people in their church really trained in the dynamics of domestic abuse. Going to a workshop over a weekend is not going to give them that kind of training. And so Call to Peace Ministries, we partner with House of Peace Publications, Dr. Deborah Wingfield, who's got 30 courses that she's written on domestic abuse and advocacy. She was a professor at Colorado State, but has been very involved with national coalitions, the Institute for Violence Against and Abuse and Trauma. So she's spoken all over the country, and she moved to North Carolina and got connected with us. And we have a 1-year curriculum with 12 of those courses. That's pretty much just research based, but she gives examples. We show what it looks like in real life. And so we hope that the churches are going to get some folks trained as advocates in their church. And until that point, Call to Peace will come alongside, walk with the pastors, help them better respond to cases of abuse that happen in their congregations. Because the thing is, like, if the church never gets it right, first of all, I believe in that we should, as God's people, we should be having fellowship one with another. And it breaks my heart when people get it wrong. And we just had a post that was a blog post that we put on our website. There was a tale of 2 survivors. One of them's church got it all wrong. I don't know if you saw that, but these are true stories of women that we know and have contact with. And one of them, I mean, her description of even setting foot in a church anymore is, I feel like I'm drowning in a pool of electrified water while everybody sits up on the deck and just watches. And nobody's doing anything. In fact, they're talking to my abuser while I'm drowning. And so it's felt like the ultimate betrayal when you go to somebody that you think should help and they don't help. But just know that that's beginning to change. And we're working with and partnering with, I think last year we talked to and helped over 300 churches across the country. So, it's changing, but we understand why they don't get it. And so the one other thing that we can do is our advocates can help women so that when they're talking to their churches, maybe they'd be better received. They're just going to be some churches that will never get it. They don't want to, they're not teachable. And that's what you need to look for in leadership in a church is, are they teachable? Are they humble enough to receive instruction? Because if they're not, then you're probably in a church that's going to cause more damage than good.
Yeah. And I think, when they have that kind of response, that can be so hard for the victims, because they see these church leaders or just leaders within the community that are believing their abuser. And I think it's sometimes it causes you to ask yourself, what is it that they see that I don't see? Or, how do they see this good person or see them as a good person? What about what's going on with me? And I think it's hard to trust people or leaders in the church. I know that with this situation with my ex, it's been really hard that there's been so many leaders that think he's a good guy. And I'm like, how do you not see it? How this doesn't make sense. Like, how do you think he's such a good guy? And I think because they think he's a good guy, it was easy for them to believe his lies. But then that causes hurt by leaders in the community, by church leaders. I mean, the fact that there was a pastor that completely, supported him and was like, you have such a pure heart. I'm like, you probably shouldn't be pastoring. What is wrong with you? Like, I mean, but it's also like, where's the issue? Is the issue with me? And I think that's sometimes what causes, I think victims, ask themselves those questions when it's not our fault at all. It's that the abuser's only showing them what he wants them to see. And, unless someone's spending a lot of time with that abuser, it's going to be really hard for them to see exactly who they truly are. And especially if it's mostly stuff on social media, you're getting little snippets and reels, and anybody can pretend to be anything. And so, it's not, you have to understand that they're not seeing what you've seen. And if they did, they probably see things a lot differently. Things aren't going to be coming through an email or a text or a message. But it doesn't mean that you're crazy. And it doesn't mean that what happened wasn't abuse and, wasn't wrong. Okay. So is there more that you can tell us about Call to Peace and everything that it's doing? I mean, it's an amazing organization.
Thank you. Oh my, well, when I was getting out of abuse 20 some years ago, I said, God, if you help me survive this, I will help other women. And he kind of held me to it. So I started helping women almost like I got out, and 95, I separated. 96, I moved back to North Carolina where I had grown up. And then in 97, I think I started with my first survivor helping somebody. And so that led me to a job with a domestic violence shelter. And it kept breaking my heart to see so many women in the church coming through those shelters, and the shelters going, what, your church told you to go back? Your church, so what a bad witness it was to the world, first of all. And so I worked there for about a year and a half, and basically, it just was breaking my heart about the church, because I had tried to reach out to churches as I was working there, and they didn't want to hear it at that point, especially not from a secular organization. And then after that, God called me to seminary, and I ended up getting a degree in biblical counseling and doing counseling in my church, and seeing the way that domestic abuse was counseled like it was a marriage issue, which it's not. You've got somebody who's got an issue of their own. So it was like it just started this fire in me. Something has to be done. Something has to be done. And so in 2015, I kept thinking, how am I going to start a ministry? I don't have, I have to work and all these things. But I finally just put a post out on Facebook and said, anybody interested in starting a domestic violence ministry? And 12 people showed up at my office on a Saturday morning in January of 2015. So by the first couple of years, we were just trying to figure out our mission and everything. And then in 2017, we started our support groups. And by the end of the year, almost 300 people had reached out to us. And I really expected it just to be a local organization. But, we have the internet now. And so it actually has kind of spread all over the country. Our support groups always have a waiting list now, but we have, I think, about 50 of them going right now.
Wow.
Online. And so we offer those free. We don't charge survivors who can't afford can't afford anything. We have healing retreats for survivors once a year.
Amazing.
And we provide scholarships for those if they need them. So basically we work 100% on donations. The things that we charge for, we will offer scholarships. So that might be books for the support groups, and that is the books that you mentioned up front. So my book and the workbook that goes with it. Basically it was just a healing process that God brought me through. So yeah, thank you. And so that is how we got started, was with support groups. And then from there, Dr. Deborah comes into my life, and it's interestingly enough, people have been asking me, would you teach an advocacy curriculum or course? And I thought, well, I don't have time to write a course. I had been through the state of North Carolina's coalitions against domestic violence's advocacy training, but a lot of it was just political correctness, and it really wasn't what I thought that I would want to teach. And then all of a sudden, here comes Dr. Deborah with 30 courses on domestic abuse and advocacy. So we started advocacy training in 2019, January 2019. To date, we've trained almost 500 people in at least one of those courses, over 500 people. And from that stems something else. So we have advocates, volunteer advocates across the country. I don't know, maybe 80 or so across the country and in a few foreign nations. And what they do is an advocate will walk alongside a victim to help them have the best outcome, whether it be with their church, with the courts, whatever it is. We walk alongside and try to help them navigate those really troubled waters, and give them back their agency, their power, that we're not telling them what to do. We're helping them make their, look at their options and make the best decisions. And we help educate them. Well, from the advocacy training, it just turned into our church partnership program. So some men were coming through our advocacy training, some pastors, in fact, a couple of them that were on our board at the time. And I just kept thinking, these pastors would really want to talk to another pastor. If I could just hire a pastor, it kept coming to my mind. And this is how God has worked with Called to Peace all along. Thought will just not leave my mind. So I finally asked one of the pastors on our board, would you be interested in working with Called to Peace, just part-time maybe? And he said, well, in fact, I talked to my church this week about going bivocational. So he had worked for a really small church, and I'm sure his salary wasn't that great. And so he said yes. And so we started this church partnership program. And in the beginning, what we were doing is, if a woman was having trouble with her pastor understanding, we would go in and work with the pastor and help him see the dynamics of abuse. And we were pretty well received. I'm not saying 100%, but maybe 70% of the pastors that we reached out to listened, and they changed the way they were responding to abuse. So that was fantastic. Well, now we ended up hiring a man named Dan Beck, who Dan has come in, and rather than just going to one church at a time, he's going to whole denominations. So we spoke out, we did a little training at the E-Free Church, the Evangelical Free Church out in Iowa back in March. He's got us going back out again in August. And he's reached out to several other denominational, like regional associations. And so at the one that we went to back in March, I think there were like 300 churches represented there. So what we hope to do is to be able to help churches and equip them to better respond to abuse. And that's been very exciting to me, to just even see that we're being received, because when I first started this work in 1997, churches just were like, it was not on their radar, and they usually were being fooled by the abusers. So things have changed, and it's so exciting. Besides that, we do have an emergency fund for people who are working with either our advocate or in one of our support groups. We will help them with household bills, from time to time. Usually there's a limit, maybe once a year, and we will help them get on their feet if they are like moving out and they need a deposit on an apartment and things like that. So those are the main prongs of the ministry.
You talked about, abuse victims getting bad advice from the church when they go to the church. And, I've heard that so much of, especially if they're married, they'll be quoted, God doesn't like divorce. And Julie Owens had recently posted something, and she posted 1 Corinthians 13:4 about love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. Love is not arrogant or rude. And she said, replace love with the name of your partner. He is patient. He is kind. He is not envious. He does not boast. And if you can't do that, then you have an issue. And I remember, this was after I ended it with my ex, but I went through, I wish I had done this sooner. I wish I had seen this poster that she had posted sooner. I went through and put his name in place of love. And I was like, this wasn't love. He can tell me all he wanted, that he loved me, he was going to protect me, talk to me about us getting married, all the stuff. This was not love. And it was really eye-opening of, wow, he wasn't even following scripture, and yet he claims to be such a godly guy, which I'm sure there's so many abuse victims where their abuser is pretending to be a good guy or a godly guy and quotes scripture to them and knows theology or whatever. But I mean, there's a lot of evil people that do evil things that know scripture, including Satan himself. And it doesn't mean that they're Christian. And so we can't just listen to their words.
Yeah.
We have to watch their actions.
Yeah. Well,
And
Jesus warned about that, right?
yeah,
Wolf in sheep's clothing, right? And that's what we see. I mean, and that's really what we're looking at here. We're not looking at just a regular marital conflict. We're not looking at two people or she's doing something to provoke him. Most of the time, victims I know are tiptoeing around trying not to provoke. And so I think that the church really needs to wake up to that truth, is that this is not a typical marriage situation. This is a situation where somebody is lording it over the other, doing exactly contrary to what the gospel teaches. You know, Jesus's kingdom is upside down. Whoever wants to be greatest of all should be servant of all. And so that's what churches really, if they can embrace what Jesus says and understand that there really are wolves within our churches, then I think that's going to make a difference. And it's starting to happen.
And I will say, like, you know, my ex, he never hit me. But he constantly tried to control what I watched, what I listened to, how I spoke. You know, he got into a huge argument and lost it over the fact that I said that a woman wants to know that her husband finds her sexy. And he's like, oh my God, you can't use that word sexy. It's against God. And I'm like, what? You know, so he wanted to control that. He wanted my hair darker. He wanted to control how I'm dressing. He wanted to control whether or not we celebrated Christmas. Like all these things of control, to the point that I was walking on eggshells, and I kept thinking, oh, what's safe to even talk about with him? Like, what is going to cause him to blow up? It caused me physical anxiety of I didn't even know what I could talk about, how I could respond or anything. And it really was this emotional, mental. I mean, he picked on me. He ripped apart how I looked in pictures that I would send him of, oh, I traveled here, oh, I traveled there. And there's this one picture where I was showing him just like my fashion sense. And he's like, I can't even look at it. It's such a turnoff. He told me my legs looked fat. And then came back and said, okay, I guess my counselor told me I can't say that to you. And I'm like, no kidding. Like, this is what? And this is a guy that was much older. I mean, but age doesn't equal maturity. And I think it's not just age. I think there's just abusers at any age. They'll try to justify anything, and it's not okay. No matter how you spin it, abuse is abuse, and it's not okay. And it doesn't have to be physical for it to be abuse. You just, you know, you have to pay attention to the warning signs. Joy, final thoughts or any message to women who are in an abusive relationship, or even any message to men who abuse? I mean, what would you like to share with the audience and viewers?
I would say that when we're going through abuse, it does two things to us, generally speaking. It will warp our view of ourselves. We don't know who we are anymore. And it also warps our view of God. We don't believe that he's good. I mean, we start to doubt his goodness at the very least. I know I did. I would not have voiced it, but I did doubt. And the thing that was so helpful to me when I was coming out of the abuse and just experiencing one horrific thing after the other was knowing that I have a God who came down and experienced the same suffering. He knows what it's like to be misused, to be mistreated by his own children, his own family, people who, and betrayed, sorry, and betrayed by someone who was supposed to be committed to him. So Judas betrayed him with a kiss, right? So our Lord understands what it's like to experience abuse. And that was very, I don't know, that's what gave me my hope, that he came down and he chose to go through the horrors of abuse, so that he could enter into our pain, our suffering, so that he could redeem our lives, and that he is a redeemer. And so he will redeem what has happened to us, the worst of it. Nothing is wasted when it comes to him. So he can take what we've been through, and not only will we come out on the other side healed if we work our healing. Now there's a process, and we have to work that process. But when we work our healing process, we don't just come out healed and okay, we got through that, but we come out better. Even researchers are calling it post-traumatic growth now. And so we know about post-traumatic stress disorder, but there's something called post-traumatic growth where we can actually overcome and come out better. And so just know that there's hope for that it's very, very possible. We would love for you to reach out to us at Call to Peace. We would put you on that path, and that's what our support groups are all about. And we can connect you with good therapists and trauma informed. They really need to be trauma informed, domestic abuse or coercive control informed. We can connect you there. And as far as the men, people, especially men who are abusers, and we do know, like when it comes to coercive control, almost 90% of the victims are women, and men tend to be more of the perpetrators. It doesn't mean that men can't be abused, and we know that they can be. And so there are not as many resources out there because it's kind of more rare as far as the coercive control dynamic goes. So that means somebody's living under oppression. And so that's not our focus at Call to Peace Ministries, but I love Leslie Vernick's books, The Emotionally Destructive Marriage and The Emotionally Destructive Relationship. You can read those and get some really great information there. As far as men who use control and power and control in their relationships, what we found is that group dynamic is one of the best things that they can do. We actually have a group for men that meets at Call to Peace Ministries. I never thought I would see that happen. But we knew that a lot of the women that we were working with are just not willing to walk away from their marriages without knowing that they've tried everything possible. And when we know that is the thing that works best. Our friend Chris Moles, who has groups that he calls Men of Peace, our groups, he actually worked with batterer intervention groups for the state of West Virginia for years, and then he created these from a biblical perspective. And so we're using his materials, and we are seeing some movement with some of these guys. But the thing is that you have to be teachable. And so a lot of times it's kind of rare, but I would still say it's less than 50%. But we are seeing some of them who actually are starting to wake up and go, wait a minute, that's not me. And look at me. I have put aside the Bible to have my way. So basically they realize that they're trying to usurp God's place in the life of their families, and they're not bowing to his lordship. So there is hope for them as well. But it requires being humble enough to receive that help. And so we see it sometimes, but again, it's not common. I think part of the problem is that there haven't been enough good resources, not because most of these guys can go in and fool any counselor. So you've got to have people who are specialists and know how to say, brother, you need to look at that again. And we're not here to hate on people who are abusive. We understand that a lot of them have trauma in their backgrounds too, but it's whether or not they're going to be humble enough to get the help that they actually need to receive that help, is whether or not they will be able to change and move forward.
Yeah. What you just said about fooling their counselors. I remember there is this time when I had talked to him about boundaries, my ex, and he said that he had a conversation with this counselor, and he said, she thinks you're controlling. And the reason she thought I was controlling was in regards to me trying to put more boundaries in place because he kept crossing boundaries, and yet somehow fooled her into thinking that I was the one that was controlling when I was doing a safety measure. So I definitely agree. They can fool counselors. And I think that doesn't help, because then, they go back to their partner and say, this is what was said. And it's like, well, wait, am I in the wrong? Am I seeing it wrong? Or I mean, a professional saying it's this way, and it can be even more confusing. And you literally can question yourself and think you are like literally going insane because of, what's going on. But it's really not that case. It's just that, the person that I had interviewed, the clinician, the neuro psychologist had said, they're really good at shape shifting and being a chameleon, and they know per person who they need to be, what part they need to play. I mean, it's coercion, it's manipulation, it's ultimately it's control. And so you're not the only one that they're trying to control. So just keep that in mind. Every relationship, every connection they're making, they're trying to control in some way. And because they're master manipulators, they're easily able to do it. Even sometimes professionals can't see it. Joy, thank you so much for being here. And I just want to remind all of my viewers and my audience about, just as Joy said, anything can be redeemed. Taking your story, especially women who have experienced abuse, just know that this isn't the end, that this isn't what your story is supposed to be. God has so much more for you and will redeem it. So, here at Live Each Day with Purpose, it's all about taking what you've been through and make a difference. Live each day with purpose, making a difference one day, one life at a time. Until next time, guys, thank you.